The year was 1977, and I was 4 years old, happily being 4 years old in Mississauga, Ontario, which was, and I guess still is, a bedroom community just west of Toronto. My life was a pretty daily routine of preschool in the morning, playing in the backyard or in my room, in the afternoons watching reruns of the 1960s Batman TV series with a towel-turned-cape safety pinned around my neck after that. There was TV in the evenings, shows like Baa Black Sheep, 8 is Enough, The Incredible Hulk, In Search Of, Happy Days, and Laverne and Shirley. Saturdays, though, meant an array of cartoons on the big three networks, as well as the Croft Super Show featuring the unfortunately monikered Captain Cool and the Kongs, yes, that is KKK, and serialized fantasy shows like Electra Woman and Dinah Girl, Bigfoot and Wild Boy, and my personal favorite, Land of the Lost. This was all Gen X culture before Generation X was defined. It was also a monoculture. We all may have been different people from different walks of life, but everybody everywhere knew the Fonz. The media we consume as children tends to dominate our memories of childhood. They provide a quick refill from the nostalgia glass when we need a quick pop culture reference. In the case of Generation X, we were really the last generation to grow up in this monoculture, and that culture influenced pretty much everything we knew. And in 1977, that culture was about to explode big time. So on this day in particular, I'd been out in the backyard playing with some Tonka trucks in my sandbox when something up in the sky caught my attention. Now, we lived under one of the flight paths to Toronto Pearson International Airport, so seeing passenger airplanes in the sky was not uncommon, and apparently by age 4 I could identify and name most of them by sight, L1011, Dash 8, DC-9, 747, and so on. But this was not an airplane. It was a red and white blimp that was that squat cigar-shaped type identical to the Goodyear blimp, which was quite famous at the time. I knew it from TV. And its presence over my neighborhood just captivated me. It was kind of sitting there. It wasn't moving. I ran inside and told my mom and dad about it. And they took a look and said, well, after dinner we can go for a walk and we'll see if we can find where it is. And I think they probably suspected what it was, but I know that they kind of wanted to keep the illusion for me going a little longer. And it also meant a walk outside in our neighborhood, which was always a fun thing. So after dinner, we loaded my sister, who was a year old at the time, into her stroller, and off we went on this winding, meandering sort of path through our subdivision and this tangled network of crescents and cul-de-sacs and streets, looking for wherever this darn blimp was just sitting there. And I think this may have been the first time in my life I'd ventured beyond the familiar and the knowable into, I guess, uncharted territory, into streets I'd never walked before. We eventually found it, the blimp, at the edge of our neighborhood, above these skeletal frameworks of a coming expansion of homes yet to be built. The blimp was just this oversized helium balloon with the logo for the construction company on it, tethered to one of the signs marking the start of the subdivision and just hanging up in the sky. I'm not sure why they put it there, but they did. And on the one hand, I was kind of disappointed that it wasn't a real blimp and that they wouldn't be taking me up for a ride or anything, but as we made the walk back home, I realized then and there that there was this whole world that existed beyond my small piece of it. And that searching for that blimp's location had taken me further and farther from my home than I think I'd walked at that point. We'd driven, obviously, all over the place, but as far as just walking and exploring this whole almost world next door was the first thing I'd really done like that. And that was the day I think I really realized, age 4, that there was a world out there beyond the world that I knew, that there was more out there than my home and my street. I've always had this fondness for the suburbs. I know they're not cool. I know they've received a fair amount of ire and been called kind of like the dead end of civilization. It's just, you picture a suburb, you picture sprawl, endless tract houses. You picture just no character, no excitement, no culture, no nothing. But for a kid growing up in the suburbs, they instill this sense of longing that I don't think you necessarily get living in a more urban environment. Maybe if you live in a small farming town or a small rural community, you know what I'm talking about here. Just, I think, knowing that we lived at the edge of a much more exciting world made us want to experience and explore all that those landscapes had to offer. There was this persistent glow on the horizon. But to me, the suburbs are adventure, and they are longing, and they're one of those things that make us want to go and experience all that the world has to offer, whether we find it around the next corner, in that new subdivision down the street, or in a galaxy far, far away.
Somewhere in space, this may all be happening right now. 20th Century Fox and George Lucas, the man who brought you American Graffiti, now bring you an adventure unlike anything on your planet. Star Wars.
Here they come. Coming in too fast.
The story of a boy, a girl, and a universe. It's a big, sprawling space saga of rebellion and romance. It's a spectacle, light years ahead of its time.
I am C-3PO, human cyborg relations, and this is my counterpart, R2-D2.
Hello.
It's an epic of heroes.
Good luck.
And villains. And aliens from 1,000 worlds. Star Wars, 1 billion years in the making, and it's coming to your galaxy this summer.
So, Star Wars. I was going to have to get to Star Wars at some point, and I decided, well, Star Wars really has to kick everything off, because seeing Star Wars is the movie experience that really triggered my interest in movies, both watching them but also making them. And Gen Xers have a particular affinity for Star Wars, and nearly 50 years on from its release, I think it kind of remains the ultimate Gen X movie. Or to put it another way, if you were born between, say, 1965 and 1973, you were old enough to see Star Wars in the theater in 1977, and I don't think it's any small exaggeration to say that for many of us, it changed our lives forever. There was a before Star Wars and an after Star Wars. If, like me, it was the first movie you ever saw or remember seeing, you never really forgot it either. It became this instant piece of Gen X culture. Both the movie and everything surrounding it. The toys, yes, but you had the novelization and the comic book adaptation and the storybook album and the storybook to refresh our memories between waits to see Star Wars again and again and again. We saw it multiple times in 1977 and 1978. If you had the toys, you could dramatize events from the film, you could create new scenarios on your own, and failing that, you went to see it again and again and again. And after Jaws, which came out a couple of years earlier, Star Wars was probably the first movie where the number of times you saw it were more important than seeing it at all, which set the stage for the next 40 plus years of filmmaking in films, where we go to the same movie over and over and watch it on video over and over. Now, to clarify, here on out, when I say Star Wars, I'm referring to George Lucas's original 1977 film, that version of it. Before it was renamed Episode 4, before it was subtitled A New Hope, before it became the 4th chapter in a 9-chapter plus spin-off movies and TV series before the special editions, back when it was just a one-and-done space opera divorced from a more expansive story. That's the one I'm talking about. Because back when we had to assume it was a one-and-done deal, that was because in the 70s, sequels generally weren't a thing. Sure, there were James Bond movies, there was The Godfather Part 2, there were 4 Planet of the Apes sequels and a short-lived TV series, there were 3 Dirty Harry movies, and numerous sequels to 1970s Airport. But with the exception of The Godfather Part 2 and the Bond films, these were really just cash grabs coasting on that enormously successful first film, released to, I would say, increasingly diminished returns, though I do hold a certain fondness for Conquest of Planet of the Apes, and the Roger Moore run of James Bond movies is probably my favorite, just because it's the era that I first discovered James Bond and first became a fan, but we'll get to Bond later on, I promise. Star Wars, though, may have followed that same trajectory of being one and done, but for the one element that I think has become irrevocably tied to that suburban life Minius grew up in, and to Star Wars itself, which is the toys.
Star Wars. You and your children loved it. Now, the Earthlings at Kenner have asked my associate and me to present the Star Wars collection. Truly remarkable toys and games for your children. What are you so excited about now? My goodness, the Star Wars TIE Fighter and X-Wing fighter. Now your children can relive our great space battles, or collect our wonderful Star Wars companions with Kenner's Star Wars action figures. But it's a little new.
See, Star Wars didn't really become a big deal to 70s kids until 1978, when the first Kenner action figures and play sets and vehicles began appearing at the toy store. We'd certainly seen Star Wars numerous times by that point, either in 1977 or during one of its later re-releases. You got to remember, movies played a lot longer back then, and it was not at all outside the realm of possibility for a movie like Star Wars to still be playing somewhere in the spring of 1978 after a continuous year of showing in the theaters. It just never really went away until they pulled it from theaters. But up until that point, most of us could only experience or re-experience that galaxy far, far away through the comic books and the bubblegum cards, storybooks. Up to that point, movie merchandising was kind of minimal. There were some Planet of the Apes toys released throughout the 1970s, as well as some Star Trek ones. Movie merchandise in the 70s generally meant t-shirts and posters and keychains and maybe a soundtrack album, but Star Wars changed all that. And ever since, merchandising has been this pot of gold every studio hopes lies at the end of the rainbow. Now, I saw my first Star Wars action figures while touring what was intended to be my first elementary school in Mississauga. At that point, I didn't yet know that there had been talk about my dad being transferred way out west to Vancouver, British Columbia. So my mom felt it was best to at least cover the bases and register me in Mississauga just in case Vancouver didn't happen. And I remember while looking in at the kindergarten classroom through the window in the doorway, I saw it was playtime, and one kid had this C-3PO toy, and it was a small action figure. It was made of shiny, vacuum-sealed, chromed plastic, and it just gleamed. And I could not take my eyes off this thing. I mean, my mom and the teacher and the administrator were yammering on about the adjustment from preschool to kindergarten. All I was thinking about was, where did that kid get a C-3PO, and where can I get that one too? And the answer to that came probably the next day, maybe a little later, at one of the local shopping malls, which was possibly Square One, which is still a fixture in Mississauga. And we were passing a toy store, and they had this big display out front, this rack loaded with Star Wars action figures. And I did what most kids do, is I begged and whined to my mom to buy me one or two. 3 would have been better. And for some reason, she agreed. And I came home that day with an R2-D2, a C-3PO, and a Darth Vader, because obviously you need someone for R2 and 3PO to run away and hide from. And that was sort of the start of it. More action figures followed, obviously, and they really did become this gateway to endless adventures in that backyard sandbox where I first saw that blimp, while my Fisher-Price Little People, Play Family Village, and Tonka truck sat disused. Changing childhood tastes are hard on once-loved toys, and this was kind of the case with me. I had Star Wars bed sheets and wallpaper. I had the bubblegum cards, the soundtrack album, and the Marvel Comics giant size movie adaptation. Was I spoiled by my parents? Yes. But speaking just as a father right now, I do realize that a lot of this is strategic, that the easiest way to get your kid to settle down and play quietly so you can get dinner on the table and laundry in the dryer was as simple as a Greedo action figure, surprising you when you come home from school. And even back then, I was a very quiet and very imaginative kid, and this Star Wars ephemera just really held my attention constantly. The action figures, I like to say, were the currency we paid to re-experience the adventure and the excitement and the magic of that movie. They were this thing that bonded you with old friends and helped you make new ones. Owning a number of Star Wars figures made you somebody others wanted to be friends with, especially if you also owned the Death Star playset, and they didn't.
Here's the new Star Wars Death Star space station that you put together. Action figures each sold separately.
Darth Vader's firing a laser cannon. It's been hit. He's after Luke. Take the elevator. Hurry! Now cross the light bridge. You won't escape me. Jump, Luke. Oh no, the trash compactor. There's a trash monster. The wall's closing. Save!
Kenner's new Star Wars Death Star space station. Action figures each sold separately.
On to the movie now. I've been going on probably far too long about toys. My dad actually took me to see Star Wars in, I think it was the fall of 1977, after the day searching for the blimp. I know that. It had been playing in theaters for some months by that point, and there was no real sign of slowing down. And one of my dad's work colleagues mentioned I might like it. And I'm not sure what theater in Mississauga we went to, but what I do remember is sitting in my chair with a full bucket of popcorn in my hands, and the lights dimming, and the movie starting, and there was the big Star Wars title, and then there was the crawl. There was no Episode 4 or A New Hope. It was just the title crawl as a period of Civil War. And my dad leaned over and quietly read it to me, just so I could follow along what was happening. And then the movie began. And everybody knows the shot where we pan down to the planet of Tatooine, and there's a roar of engines, and this little rebel blockade runner goes rocketing overhead, fleeing something. And then the Star Destroyer blasts overhead, and it just kept going and going and going and going. And we must have been in a pretty good theater with a pretty decent sound system, because it felt like the whole place was shaking. It felt like the Star Destroyer was actually flying overhead. And that was the moment where that big bucket of popcorn that my dad had bought me slipped from my fingers and fell to the floor and spilled popcorn all over the aisle floor. And apparently I just sat there transfixed for the whole movie. I didn't move. I didn't touch my drink. Thankfully, I didn't spill it either. But I was just completely enraptured with this film. And I was almost having an out-of-body experience, which is part of the reason I go to the movies, is to have that experience again of not being conscious of being in the theater. It's happened 3 or 4 times in my entire lifetime, and we'll get to those movies eventually. But from that moment, I was transfixed, and from that moment, I was forever a Star Wars fan. So I think the question that has to be asked is, why Star Wars? Why did it work? Why was it such a mega success? And there have been theories, there have been books and documentaries and podcasts and just reams of ancillary material written about why Star Wars succeeded. Some said it was this sort of post-Vietnam War, post-Nixon, post-inflation malaise that the country was in, and it was looking for an escape. And Jaws kind of opened the door, and Star Wars barged right through. At a certain point, people were tired of movies like The Parallax View and Taxi Driver and Network. And there certainly had been other attempts to produce this big 4-quadrant blockbuster. But why does Star Wars occupy this space in the genx brain when so many other films and experiences play second fiddle to it nearly 50 years on? First, I think because Star Wars is not science fiction. It's fantasy, space fantasy specifically, which was a term possibly coined by George Lucas himself. It wasn't about the science or technology. It wasn't a speculative, where are we going, that 2001: A Space Odyssey was. In Stanley Kubrick's film, outer space was the silence of the void. And contrasting that, Star Wars, it was all about explosions and X-Wings and TIE fighters and the Millennium Falcon screeching through space as though they're aerodynamically maneuvering through some atmosphere. This was a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. This wasn't in the future. This was a myth for our modern age, like King Arthur and Robin Hood had been. It referenced these myths that we were already familiar with. It distilled them to their most basic elements and created this brand new flavor that tantalized our taste buds then and still does. But I think because it tasted familiar enough to give it all this comforting sense of well-being, that the good guys would win, that the bad guys would lose, and roll credits. What Star Wars definitely did expose, though, I think, was a lack of fantasy in our lives, while giving us our daily lives in a fantasy setting. Because what is Tatooine other than every small town and suburb far, far away from those supposed bright lights in the galaxy? If you think of it that way, you work your moisture farm, you race T-16s through Beggar's Canyon, you go to pick up power converters at Tosche Station and waste time with your friends in the process. Each of these otherworldly and largely only spoken of references, which Star Wars is very light on its feet in that regard, has a real-world connection and an equivalent, from your boring suburban or rural home to the car you race through the streets to hanging out at the pool hall with your friends. We didn't really know Luke Skywalker's world, but we understood it, which is why, for me, this first Star Wars movie remains the best one, because it's about something other than just being Star Wars. It wasn't the spaceships or the droids. It wasn't this clash of lightsabers. It wasn't that mystical energy field that surrounds us and penetrates us and binds the galaxy together. It was about escaping that boring, average, everyday life and seeking adventure elsewhere. It was about stepping off your front porch, hopping on your bicycle, and venturing down your street further than you ever have been to that point, either to track down an elusive blimp or to book passage to the Alderaan system. Now, this connection hit 4-year-old me approximately 25 minutes into the movie, when Uncle Owen tells Luke he needs to stay on the farm another year and not go to the academy as planned. There's a lame reasoning that harvest is when he's needed the most, and it's only for another year, which is the same thing Uncle Owen said when Luke's friends Biggs and Tank left. Luke storms off, muttering it looks like he's going nowhere, and we cue John Williams' Binary Sunset theme as Luke stands up on the surface and gazes at the setting twin suns of Tatooine. What Luke is thinking is never explicitly stated through dialogue, but it doesn't need to be, because we knew, 4-year-old me knew watching it. Here was a kid who wished he could escape his parents' watchful eye, if only for a short while. This is every teenager who wanted to go off to college or just downtown with friends and told they couldn't. And this was every 4-year-old who saw a blimp in the skies above his suburban tract. It's my favorite single moment in all of Star Wars, and quite possibly in all of the movies I've ever seen, because it says everything while saying and speaking nothing. It is the purest of cinema. It is the one thing that art form can do that no other can, certainly not as well. And it's one of those moments that just typifies a great film, in that it's a moment that more mercenary producers or studio executives would probably say cut it because it doesn't add anything, but in its absence everything is diminished. I remember a documentary some years back featuring Martin Scorsese, Steven Spielberg, and George Lucas talking about their films, and each of them was asked if they felt there was a signature shot that typified their work. For Spielberg, it was little Barry Geiler opening the farmhouse door to those kaleidoscopic alien lights in Close Encounters of the Third Kind. For Scorsese, it was Jake LaMotta shadowboxing in the ring at the beginning of Raging Bull as the credits roll. Lucas didn't have an answer for that, and he claimed he was more of an editor than a visual stylist. And I don't recall if Spielberg or Scorsese corrected him, but I think they'd all agree that the binary sunset scene is why Star Wars works. It's that theme of longing but also escape, and it recurs in Lucas's work. His previous films, THX 1138 and American Graffiti, are all about escaping the cultural and societal norms that you're placed in. It's about that longing and yearning to be someone. It's why adults my age still collect Star Wars toys, because we all remember how that moment spoke to us. other thing I admire about Star Wars is its economy of storytelling, most evident in what is possibly my favorite scene in the entire saga after the binary sunset, and it's a dialogue one. We're only 7 minutes down the road from that sunset at Ben Kenobi's home in the Jundland Wastes, where R2-D2 plays Princess Leia's message to the old general, and he and Luke sit and have a talk. All of it is what we in the business would call an info dump of exposition. One character telling another, and by extension us, what's going on. But in this case, it's so masterfully written and so well performed by Sir Alec Guinness in the way it paints a picture for Luke and for the audience listening that does the job it took 3 movies and a 7-season animated series to delve deeper into and subsequently rob much of it of its mystery. It's the Clone Wars, it's the Jedi Knights, it's Obi-Wan's friendship with Luke's father, who, as it happens, was not a navigator on a spice freighter, and it's the story of a young Jedi named Darth Vader, who destroyed it all. We don't need to see that backstory dramatized, because we have all we need. It's Kenobi doing for Luke what Star Wars is doing for all of us, telling a captive audience a story of long ago and far away. It's every tale told around a campfire. It's every answer a veteran gives when their grandchild asks what they did in the war. It's that tradition of oral storytelling passed down through thousands of years from the time of early man sitting around the campfire telling tales of their hunt. Speaking for myself, and I recognize I am in the minority here, I did not need to see Darth Vader's backstory. I didn't need to see it dramatized because I already had enough. He was a perfect villain. That line from Obi-Wan, where he says a young Jedi named Darth Vader, who was a pupil of mine before turning to evil, helped the Emperor hunt down and destroy the Jedi. He betrayed and murdered your father. It was enough to spark waves of imagination without diminishing his embodiment of evil. Even lines like Luke asking Obi-Wan with reverence, "You fought in the Clone Wars," are details in themselves because they're spoken in such awe, and they imply all sorts of things, like Luke being aware of the Clone Wars as a thing that happened a long time ago, and we didn't really need to know exactly what they were. It was 2 words together that were evocative and made our imaginations kind of fill in the rest. And I think that was the real strength in Star Wars, in that it provided this lived-in feeling to the story we were watching. They didn't necessarily need to be spelled out later. Imagination fills in the gaps as details of the story written are shown. Star Wars, and to be frank, most genre filmmaking of the past 30-odd years, has been all about filling in the gaps, dramatizing a backstory and histories through sequels and spin-offs and prequels and reboots and TV series, all which really kind of prevent the viewer from utilizing that pesky imagination of theirs to imagine a possible backstory for the characters. We used to play with our toys. Now we set them on the shelf in dioramas, dramatizing what's been done, rather than just playing with them, rather than just imagining with them and making up stories of our own. We've become addicted to canon and completionism over just letting ourselves and our minds wander down inspired roads and finding wonder, frankly, lurking where once was just a backyard sandbox or a neighborhood playground that could have been an Imperial base, the mines of Moria, or Asgard. Quite simply, Vader was not the same terrifying evil as before the backstory, before the prequels, before The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. Once we had a piece of information about him that we didn't have before, it ceased to be him as the villain and more as the tragic figure, which kind of neuters everything that follows and, frankly, everything that precedes it. For me, the greatest pleasures in Star Wars remain its simplest ones. It's the ones that keep me returning to it through the years. By comparison to the rest of the films, it is the creakiest and the shoddiest, the most slapdash. Nowhere near as polished as subsequent installments, though polished is the best you can say about some of them, if I can be a little catty. But I think that rough and tumble, down and dirty nature remains its greatest strength. Yes, you can see the wires pulling R2-D2 across the Dune Sea, and you can tell the lightsabers and Vader's and Kenobi's duel are bending plastic, and once you see that stormtrooper bonk his head on the doorframe, you can't miss it. And those mistakes are what I think make Star Wars work. It's that little bit of grit in the gears that will give a piece of machinery its own unique rhythm. If you remove all of that and replace it with a perfectly composed digital sheen, it's no longer the same film, and it's nowhere near as believable, ironically. I think in a sense Star Wars became a bit of a victim of its own success. Each successive sequel, prequel, multimedia spin-off filling in the gaps that the viewer's imagination once did. Simply put, I think for many of us Star Wars fans, it lost a lot of its appeal the more we learned about this galaxy far, far away. For a generation of suburban kids like me raised on it, Star Wars is the ultimate suburban film without actually being set in the suburbs. At its core, Luke's journey is about growing up. It's about venturing into the unknown, and it's that thrill you get when you buckle up for takeoff on an airplane transporting you to a different piece of the world. It's this nervous energy you get when moving to a new town and starting a new school. When Luke first feels the Force on the Millennium Falcon after defeating a training remote with his father's lightsaber, what Obi-Wan says to him could apply to every child who takes that first bike ride alone, who ventures into the big city with friends, and says goodbye to their parents as they embark on their adult lives. You have taken your first step into a larger world. There is a small addendum to this story, and it comes some months later when either my mom or dad surprised me with a gift of the giant-sized Marvel Comics adaptation of Star Wars, written by Roy Moore, illustrated by Howard Chaykin. And man, I must have read that thing cover to cover more times than I can recount. In that era before home video and TV broadcasts of Star Wars, the comic adaptation or movie novelization was how you relived the experience. Anyway, the inside covers of this book had some photos from the production. The inside front cover is a shot from the end of the film of Luke and Han receiving their medals from Princess Leia. So the whole cast is kind of taking their bow there, and it says a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. I have it in front of me right now. You're going to hear me turning pages probably, but the inside back cover was a single photo of Sir Alec Guinness sitting next to this young bearded gentleman who I didn't know at the time was actually George Lucas, but underneath the illustration it says, or the photo, it says, director, writer, creator George Lucas enjoys a quiet moment on the set with Ben Kenobi, Sir Alec Guinness. And that, I think, was probably the moment that I realized that one man was responsible for all of this, that this was my first step into a much larger world. The realization that movies weren't these things that happened. They weren't put on the screen by magic, that they were created by people. They were created by writers, directors, filmmakers, and actors. As I said, it was my first step into this much larger world, but it would take some years still before I realized just how momentous that moment was. And this brings us to the end of our second installment of the Celluloid Heroes podcast. Again, I'm your host, Brad Abraham, and I am still getting the hang of this whole talking thing about movies. But we are still at the beginning of a journey that will take us through 50 key movies of the Gen X era, so I hopefully have some time to find the right groove, and I hope you all stick with me. If you want to reach out to me, you can do so on my website, bradabraham.com. My social media handle is not Brad Abraham. I don't use social media as much. If you want to liaise with me direct, my website is the best way to do it since I do update it regularly. But that is that. And I will be back next month, though, with a new tale from 1978. and the story behind a movie you probably first experienced on the small screen, but I experienced on a much larger one.